just passed over into the twilight zone.
Hi, this is Jose Barrera. Tonight we're going to be diving into Ectoplasma, and we're going to be splashing into Dr. T.G. Hamilton. A lot of these photos are controversial because they look sort of hoaxed, like someone put cotton to the mouths of these people. But can you see the dark side of this? Can you use your imagination and step into the other world, which we don't ever understand until we see it for ourselves? So tonight we're going to be getting into Dr. T.G. Hamilton and Ectoplasma. Here we go.
Twilight zone.
Okay, let's dive into T.G. Hamilton here at the Strange Sessions with your host, Jose Barrera.
The night was still young when the car pulled up in front of an elegant home on Henderson Boulevard in an upper-class neighborhood of Winnipeg known as Westgate. It was a two-story, Dutch-style home, typical of upper-class society. In spite of the lights, the visitors can see that there is no one in the rooms on the first floor. But the man knew better. In fact, you might say that there were more guests than the number of people invited. The visitor joined a group that was gathered in a specially arranged room on the second floor. Men and women were seated on chairs in a horseshoe pattern. Behind the guests were a dozen or so cameras, all pointed at the group. The cameras were all linked to a remote control button. A small wooden table was placed in the middle of the room. In silence, all of the participants joined hands and pressed their feet against those of the person next to them to form a human chain. The strange seance was about to begin.
Oh, spirits, friends from the great beyond, do you wish to communicate with us? My friends, are you there?
Suddenly a noise could be heard. It sounded like a piece of furniture was wobbling on its legs. As a flash went off, the participants stared in wonder. The table was floating upside down, a meter off the ground. Everyone had the same thought. I hope that picture turns out. In the post-World War I era, as some 8 million victims were being buried, interest in psychic research and communications with the spirit world was mounting as never before. In France, the International Metapsychic Institute was carrying out a series of experiments led by Dr. Charles Richet, the 1913 Nobel Prize winner in the field of medicine. In Canada, another physician, Dr. T.G. Hamilton, was also wading into this controversial field of research.
Dr. Glenn Hamilton was one of those really interesting people who was born in Ontario and eventually ended up in Manitoba and became a doctor out there. He had an illustrious career. He was a member of the Manitoba legislature, involved in the medical school at the University of Manitoba, and probably Canada's most famous psychic researcher in the 1930s. friend of his, Dr. Abbott, who is at the University of Manitoba in the English department, went down to the United States to see a phenomena where a woman, through Ouija boards, was receiving information from a woman called Patience Worth. And over a period of time, this Patience Worth translated from the other side, from the spirit side, whole books, poetry, novels at a tremendous rate. Dr. Abbott came back and talked to Hamilton about it, and I think that was in 1928, and at that point the spark of interest happened.
Thomas Glendenning Hamilton became interested in psychical research because his son had died as an infant around the end of the First World War, and I believe that he was not able to get over the death, and so ended up investigating life after death in order to find out what had happened to his son.
Hamilton set up a laboratory in a large room on the second floor of his home on Henderson Boulevard. He was aware of the importance of taking photographs during the seances. They would be vital to supporting his research.
Hamilton had arranged a series of cameras along with automatic flashes that would be able to be set off in the complete darkness to try and record some of these manifestations. Some were stereo cameras, some were arranged to take different perspectives, some were arranged to take specific close-ups, but the idea was to try and photograph these manifestations in complete blackness, and was able to produce some remarkable photographs of objects apparently emanating from the mouths, the noses, the ears of the medium.
This element is ectoplasm, a substance that is given off by mediums and which makes up the human body and various objects. In the 1920s, Hamilton and his colleagues studied all phenomena associated with spiritual communications, but especially manifestations of ectoplasm. Abiding by his own rules, Hamilton only called upon non-professional mediums, volunteers that he knew personally who agreed to abide by all of his control measures. Upon arrival, the medium would be searched to make sure that no strange substances were being brought into the laboratory. Once inside the room, the medium asked to hold the hands of the individuals sitting on either side. For the duration of the experiment, the medium's hands never left those of the guardians. And while the medium was in a trance, spirits would manifest themselves by means of ectoplasm.
I think part of the attraction is the picture itself. There's still a profound respect for the picture that's worth 1,000 words. And people believe pictures. You see things in the exploitive press, and as long as there's a picture there, people will believe. He was a doctor. Doctors had a profound position in the community, and still do, as people of honesty and integrity. He was a member of the provincial legislature, and so in fact, I think he himself was believable. The fact that he dealt with photographs meant what he researched could be looked at and separated from him, and the picture itself became the statement of his truth. And he was allowed to do this research without personal attack.
Between 1928 and 1933, T.G. Hamilton organized dozens of such seances. Guests came from all over the world to attend these experiments, including novelist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created the famous Sherlock Holmes, and William Lyon Mackenzie King, the future Prime Minister of Canada.
There wasn't just lawyers and doctors, as we know, were involved, but it was also even the Prime Minister of Canada in the 30s, when William Lyon Mackenzie King in the early 30s became interested in the question of survival in spirit communication.
Although the seances and the photos convinced Hamilton and his companions that the soul lives on after death, many believe that his experiments were just a hoax.
I think it's quite clear that Hamilton himself believed very strongly, and I don't think that he would participate knowingly in any fraud. Some of the photographs look extremely suspicious, And certainly there is the notion that there was fraud going on in those circles of investigative circles at that time.
He was serious about what he was doing. He tried to do the investigations with very strict scientific methodology, and yet one must wonder, from looking at some of the photographs and the samples of writing that were produced, why some of these things that appear to be hoaxes or could be easily hoaxed were believed so intensely by the individuals involved.
All of the people who were directly involved in the research, were convinced of the authenticity of the research, including many years later. In some cases, 30, 40, 50 years later, people were still writing positively about their experiences.
A number of other prominent physicians and politicians who were involved and testified that the mediums did not appear to be bringing anything into the room, nothing left the room. The room itself was secured so that there was no possibility of someone entering and depositing something that could be taken out later and pretended to be a manifestation. So there were some very good scientific restrictions and some good methodology in trying to study what was occurring to prevent hoaxing, and yet the possibility of a hoax can never be ruled out.
At the end of each seance, a record of what was observed was signed by all of the participants. It seems highly unlikely that all of these individuals would have signed if the seances had been a hoax. Skeptics claim that it would have been more worthwhile to get a sample of ectoplasm for analysis, rather than simply photographing it. They also question why mediums no longer produce this ectoplasm that used to be so popular.
Teleplasm was very interesting phenomenon. It was widespread at the time that it was in vogue, if we might say that, and oftentimes the teleplasm would have images of people and things inside the teleplasm. Now I think the people look at the teleplasm and it looks completely ridiculous.
Today we largely want to be entertained. We've become used to the radio, the television, and most recently video games and the internet. And to sit night after night, week after week, for months on end to develop this type of phenomenon is extremely boring. Yeah. And this is what the mediums, the Hamilton mediums, reported. They were bored. They did not want to continue meeting for such length of time and not really knowing what was going on. They weren't aware of the phenomena that was being produced in many cases.
I think the fact that so many of these effects, such as automatic writing and ectoplasm and teleplasm, can be duplicated by stage magicians, has sort of put these on the back burner. I think because they can be easily duplicated and can be so easily hoaxed, that people want more solid physical evidence.
If you are viewing this film, then we are under extraterrestrial attack. Beware, your brain may no longer be the boss. If you are beginning to doubt what I am saying, you are probably hallucinating. Listen carefully.
Hi, hello, this is Jose with Strange Sessions. We're going to take a little break and listen to Homeboy Sandman with Strange Planets to give you a little bit of time to sit back and think about what just transpired.
Get hit. Stranded on his space planet, see his fate is here, his spending. What's more weight than his ears, dangerous, satanic. Homo sapiens are host neighbors, a holy savage sex tape can bring it from hope status to holy status. Find different tribes, some of their eyes slanted. Minds out of their mind, others is mild-mannered. 4 seasons, though some regions are more static. More reasons I'm raw, vegan, and organic. The air's filthy, the land's filthy, the water's putrid. More harmony, souls, Buddha, and Confucius. More units, they all humans, they all the bloopers from the same slang. Cubans was called Cubans. The boys bully the girls, the pale skins bully the browns, who were once service the clowns because of their crowns. People now vote in the clown and give them the clout. People stuck butt on the couch, head in the clouds. You should see these husbands that these women allow. People don't live in the now, they live in the now. It takes way more muscles when you muster a frown than it takes face muscles when you muster a smile. But everybody doesn't mind putting muscle to use. Now we'll move a muscle less it's in pursuit of the grade or blowing pursuit. Of course you see the grade and abuse from a distance where you can see it's the grade and the blue. It go P-L-A-N-E-C-E-A-R-T-H-Days-R-I-T evenings and all-key P-L-A-N-E-C-E-A-R-T-H-Days-R-I-T evenings and all-key P-L-A-N-E-C.
Hi, okay, we're back. Right now, we're going to splash into Dr. T.G. Hamilton Psychic Research's files.
Dr. Hamilton's work did not begin with attempting to prove that consciousness continues after death. He had heard of the patient's Worth Ouija board writings from his friend Dr. Allison. Dr. Allison had spoken in his home church after himself visiting with Mrs. Curran and seeing firsthand how the writings were being produced. In October and November of 1918, Dr. Hamilton and his friend and pastor, Dr. McLaughlin, decided to investigate the possibility of telepathic communication, and were soon convinced that such communication did in fact exist. During those experiments, a prophecy came in the form of a voice that seemed to come from within Dr. Hamilton's mind, that predicted that he would do work that would echo around the world and prove the continuation of consciousness beyond death. He was so shocked by this phenomenon, being a devout Presbyterian, that he and his friend decided that somehow wicked forces had entered their work, and that this work must be stopped immediately to preserve both their sanity and the future destination of their souls. He spent the next 3 days in bed, incapacitated by worry and doubting his own sanity, while his wife Lillian, a registered nurse, plied him with sedatives. He stopped all work for the time being. He was determined that this was to be the end of his investigations into the psychic realms. However, early on the evening of October 20, 1920, 3 people unexpectedly dropped into the Hamilton home for a chat. They were Mr. Ernest Court, a well-read Englishman, Assistant Secretary of the Manitoba Medical Society, and his school-aged daughter. There was also their little Scots friend, Mrs. Elizabeth Poole, who had long been regarded as a member of the Hamilton family, but who knew nothing of psychical research or spiritualism, and who had had very little education. In fact, just enough to allow her to do a little ciphering, read books of the adolescent type, and write legible letters, although often the words were misspelled and punctuation marks were absent. During the evening, quite by chance, Mr. Court introduced the subject of psychical research, regarding which he knew the Hamiltons had some interest. He asked if they had ever tried table tipping, an old parlor game, which he had seen done in the old country, and which he had himself experienced once, and which, now and then, he said, brought to light various mind products not easily explained along any known, normal, orthodox lines, and in some cases even gave out communications evidential of certain dead people. Intrigued by Mr. Court's description of the results sometimes obtained by this simple experiment, they brought a small wooden table, about the size of an ordinary piano bench, into the room. To their utter astonishment, As they sat on the four sides of the small table, with their fingertips lightly touching its surface, the table became agitated as if in the hand of a giant. Soon it began to pound up and down in tilts on two legs in a most aggressive and decided manner. Mr. Court suggested that Dr. Hamilton repeat the alphabet. This he did, calling out A, B, C, D over and over, with the table tilting to indicate the appropriate letter. Lillian's mother, Mrs. John Forrester, took down the indicated letters. Then the process was repeated. It was a laborious and time-consuming way to receive messages. After a few minutes, the table stopped. Lights were turned up, and the message studied. The table had tipped out a message purportedly from Myers, who claimed to be the chief spokesman. Plato, Book 10, Allegory very true. Read Lodge. Trust his religious sense. Myers. Myers and Stead are here. Stead answers doctor's questions. The Hamiltons had no acquaintance with the works of Plato. They did not know at the time of the sitting that the Republic had 10 books, but they had read Myers's Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death. They were the only sitters who realized the significance of the name, mentally asking, can this be the Myers? Myers appeared to be saying that in his new state as a discarnate, he found these teachings to be very true. He also added that he was being helped to communicate by the famous journalist W.T. Stead, who had died as one of the passengers when the Titanic went down in 1912. The Hamiltons knew about Lodge and his belief in life after death, and the possibility of communication between the two states under certain rather particular circumstances. They also knew about Myers, but of Plato they knew nothing. Myers had written in the 1890s about dreams, hallucination, creativity and genius, hysteria, multiple personality, apparitions, trance mediumship, automatic writing, telepathy, and hypnosis. All of these phenomena involve what Myers called automatisms, that is, the coming into consciousness of latent subliminal materials or motor processes that were allowed to emerge because the normal waking consciousness barriers had become more unstable and permeable. Myers produced a theory of the subliminal self. In his theory, our normal waking consciousness is but a small subset of the larger individuality or self. It is the environment that calls forth the specific aspects of the unconscious that will emerge to respond to the circumstances of ordinary life. This interpretation was very different from the conceptions of Freud's model of repression. Freud and others viewed these subliminal phenomena as abnormal or unhealthy. Myers believed that all these phenomena are the outworking of a basic psychological process, namely the loosening of the barriers between the unconscious and the conscious areas of mind. Encouraged by the evidentiality of the so-called Myers message, Dr. Hamilton and Lillian occasionally held table sittings with the same little group, the theory being that as this group had functioned once successfully as a sort of composite medium, then perhaps other important results might be obtained. There the matter stood in early 1921. Lillian had found time to read W.J. Crawford's books dealing with the phenomena of materialization. She wondered if possibly little Mrs. Poole might have a potential similar to that demonstrated by Crawford's medium, Kathleen Gallagher. As Mrs. Poole was a most obliging and dear soul, she readily agreed to sit occasionally with Lillian. About once a month, starting in February of 1921, the two ladies met and sat quietly in a darkened room on the second floor of the Hamilton home. Again, the table behaved in that same strange manner, tilting away from Mrs. Poole, striking the floor in a regular rhythm, up, down, tilt, bang. At this time, in spite of the demands of a large private practice and much committee work, Dr. Hamilton's interest in psychic phenomena was again growing. Fully aware of the general public's attitude of scorn and derision directed towards anyone showing interest in such matters, and rightly fearful lest his professional reputation be tarnished if his own interest were to become known, Dr. Hamilton kept his interest a closely guarded confidence between very close friends. In May of 1921, the Hamiltons accidentally discovered that it was Mrs. Poole who possessed the marked incipient powers for the production of psychical phenomena. She was at this time 49 years of age and previously unaware that she possessed mediumistic faculties of any kind. The Hamiltons welcomed the opportunity for first-hand investigation and prevailed upon her to allow these faculties to be developed. She consented, and in August of 1921 they commenced their first series of experiments in telekinetic phenomena. A few months' further experimentation revealed the fact that she also possessed mental mediumistic faculties, and from that time on these two phases developed collaterally, eventually giving brilliant manifestations in both fields. In the physical phase, they obtained conversational rappings, very powerful contact phenomena, various forms of telekinesis, and wax impressions of small materialized forms. In the telekinesis experiments, Dr. Hamilton fastened a hook into his living room ceiling and suspended a small pulley system with a spring scales in such a way that the change in weight of the small 10 or 12 pound table could be determined. It was found that if the table were asked to become heavier, it eventually increased up to 40 pounds in weight, and if it were asked to decrease, it could easily lose all its weight. This was true even when no one was touching the table. This clearly was in contradiction to the debunkers, who tend to claim that someone must be touching an item in order for it to levitate. This allows them to claim that some sort of unconscious force is being applied by the mediums or others touching the table. It was soon discovered that the force, whatever it was, issued from Mrs. Poole's abdomen in the form of invisible arms, which gripped the table from beneath and held it steady for an appreciable length of time against pressure. This was in line with Crawford's findings. He had named these invisible streams of energy pseudopods. Mrs. Poole often felt pain in the abdominal area when the forces were struggling with each other. Often this pain became so great that the experiment had to be terminated. After several months' work and many experiments of this sort, Dr. Hamilton concluded that the results of his experiments agreed very well with the experiments of Dr. Crawford. He had thus confirmed the Gallagher experiments. There was no room for doubt that a suitable medium could produce kinesthetic effects. Eventually the table, quite on its own after initial charging by Elizabeth Poole, could levitate several feet off the floor and do somersaults in the air, quite without anyone touching it. 40 planned experiments convinced Dr. Hamilton of the following. Telekinetic energy was a fact. This energy was probably carried or released by ectoplasm, the two phenomena being immediately related and perhaps one and the same. The apparatus that made the raps and moved the table issued from the lower part of Mrs. Poole's body, spontaneously, that is, without her conscious volition playing any part. Back of it all stood a supernormal intelligence. The table responded to instructions exactly as if there were some intelligence guiding it. It seemed unlikely that this intelligence originated with Mrs. Poole, at any rate not at the level of her consciousness. What that intelligence was, he was not prepared to say. The evidence that the dead were present was still insufficient for him to advance such a tremendous hypothesis. It was possible that the dead were the operators, but it was not proven.
You've just crossed over into the device.
Wow, that was some extraordinary stuff right there with Dr. T.G. Hamilton and Poole and flying tables and seances, ectoplasma coming out of people's body orifices. It was awesome, strange, and a little funny. We're going to get down to it right now, what I think. Okay, people. Do you believe T.G. Hamilton's research? Do you believe in ectoplasma? Now we're going to be diving into some Ghostbusters stuff here, talking about ectoplasma. But what is ectoplasma? Is it a cotton ball ripped up out of a pillow, or some kind of a couch or something that this guy is just pulling the hoax over people's eyes? Or is it really some crazy stuff that seeps out of mediums and different types of spiritual people? That's what it's supposed to be, right? Some kind of creepy spiritual soul, or some type of entity that comes out of your body when you're close to spiritual type things. It's pretty strange. But that's how I'm going to end the show tonight. Do you think this was true, or was it a hoax? Me, I think it was pretty cool. And this guy must have been doing something with his life, because if he was just wasting his life pulling hoaxes over people's eyes and tricking people into believing into ectoplasma for he can make money off of them, I don't think this guy would have lasted as long as he did. Someone would have found out this, because if it was cotton and he was tricking people, or he was paying people to do this, someone would have started talking. So what I think is it is probably true, because there's a lot of strange things in this world. So have a good night, morning, evening, day, or whatever. This is Jose Barrera with the Strange Sessions. Have a good night. Day, morning, or whatever.